Well, we've come to the final time limitation, and we still have a considerable amount of material to cover, so I decided to focus in this lecture on things that you can't really easily get out of ITOE or my chapter. So I wouldn't say that this material is necessarily more advanced than what's in the printed sources, but it is a little different, goes into a little different slant and a little different issues from what's in the printed material, which I think is quite easy to understand on the points I'm covering. So the previous class yesterday on concept formation covered Ayn Rand's solution to the problem of universals, her explanation of what facts of reality concepts are based on. This class goes into the nature of concepts as formed and what concepts do for us. So just to recap the solution to the problem of universals, I'd put it this way. If you ask, where is the one in the many? The answer is not in the many, not in another world, but in the mind. Yet it is in the mind as objective, not subjective, because it's based on the fact that you make a category of measurements in the conceptual common denominator, and all the concretes have measurements that fall within that range. That's this diagram. The facts that make concept formation objective, not subjective, are that A and B are close together compared to C. Not in an absolute sense, remember. It's relative closeness. Closeness in a context. Closeness when differentiated. Now, I'm going to go into CCD, the conceptual common denominator, as the next step, and why this works. I said that, well, let me first define the CCD since that's the next slide. This is Ayn Rand's definition. The conceptual common denominator is the characteristic or characteristics reducible to a unit of measurement by means of which man differentiates two or more existents from other existents possessing it. The CCD is what allows us to say A and B belong together as opposed to C. Now, if A was a blue thing and B was a slightly more greenish blue thing and C were the square root of 16, it wouldn't work. You cannot compare three things that are not on the same scale, that are not measurable by the same unit. We're dealing with the more and the less. And you can't say the square root of 16 is more blue or less blue than a given shade of blue. You can only compare it to another hue. So there must be a commensurable characteristic reducible to a unit of measurement. Now, reducible to a unit of measurement is a little bit different than measurable by a unit of measurement. And I was puzzling over that for the first time today, preparing for this class. And I think it ties into this next statement. This is the sentence right after that sentence. The distinguishing characteristic or characteristics of a concept. Now that's the thing that distinguishes the unit, such as for man that he's a rational animal. For a triangle that it has three sides, okay? The distinguishing characteristic or characteristics of a concept represents a specified category of measurements within the conceptual common denominator involved. So this, once you understand what she's saying, this is a very radical thesis, very unusual, rather startling. She's saying what we call an attribute is, from another perspective, a range of measurements. A range of measurements. Now, within the CCD, so you don't draw, it's not pure numbers. It's numbers representing an amount of the CCD. But she's saying, three-sidedness is a range or category of measurements. You don't have to think of it as an attribute. So when we say the conceptual common denominator is reducible to a unit of measurement, it's not just saying that it's measurable by a certain unit. It's saying that from a certain perspective, it is a set of measurements. And that will be extremely important in discussing abstractions from abstractions, higher abstractions, because in higher abstractions, which we won't discuss in this course, what is CCD at one level becomes a distinguishing characteristic at the next level. So if the distinguishing characteristic is a set of measurements within a CCD, and if the CCD becomes the distinguishing characteristic, it must be reducible to measurements itself in a still wider CCD. Now let's take this triangle, because I've been saying all along range or category. And I just want to be clear that some CCDs, some commensurable characteristics you differentiate things along, are quantized. There's no middle, they're not continuous. So, number of sides of a polygon. 3, not 3.5, not 3 7/8. You jump to 4, the quadrilateral. You jump to 5, the pentagon. There's no middles. This is very common when you're dealing with principles, and particular morality. Between sacrifice of self to others and others to self, there's no middle. It's you are the sacrificial victim, or he is. You are or you are not. It's not you are 20% and he is 80%. It's quantized. Good and evil itself. There's not 50% good, 50% evil. If you're dealing with the concept good, good is good and evil is evil, and there's nothing that's not one or the other wholly. There can be actions which have good and evil aspects, but good itself is pure. So it's not like blue. Blue admits of degrees, but good and evil doesn't. Now, bringing in what I said at the end of the first lecture about fundamentals showing a different set of alternatives than superficials. Remember, I said objectivism was not in the middle between mysticism and skepticism, and if you turned it around, you saw that it was objectivism on top. Same thing here. Beneath self-sacrifice and other sacrifice, there's a wider issue which should be addressed first, but never is. The CCD is amount of sacrifice. And here I would say it isn't really digitized or quantized. The extreme is no sacrifice of anybody to anybody. But if there's going to be sacrifice, then the question arises, who's going to sacrifice to whom? But it should never arise. Because if you go to the deeper level here, you see that self-sacrifice and other sacrifice are two variants on a morality that condones sacrifice. And that morality is wrong. So, although we begin the discussion of concept formation with simple cases, like blue and she takes length, you should be aware that concepts are all somewhat individual, and there are special cases like quantized CCDs and moral principles and other types of principles which are quantized in a positive and a negative way, which are special. Then there are axiomatic concepts which have no CCD because they're too wide for there to be anything else. So there are a lot of special cases. This is just an apparatus that she has given us that you have to see how it applies somewhat differently in different cases. The CCD is crucial. Some of you remember my lecture where I said, to be a genius, know the genus. I spoke about the immense power of knowing the genus. The CCD is the attribute that makes the genus the genus. And all the errors in concept formation come down to having the wrong CCD. I believe that's a universal principle. I'm going to, state it again as all. I haven't really checked it out that there isn't an exception, but all the ones that you'll run across, all the package deals, all the anti-concepts come from choosing the wrong CCD. So if we go back to my example from last time, the Wittgensteinian chaos of going from pumpkin to basketball to blah, 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 to broom at the end. What happens here is switching CCDs. We start off with comparing the pumpkin and the basketball in shape. Then we take a new thing. Later on, we compare the basketball and the hockey stick in function. They're not alike in shape. And forget that we have switched CCD, so we really have two conceptualizations, and try to say the pumpkin is like the hockey stick, which is like a broom in shape again. So the error is in choosing a new CCD in the middle of the concept forming process. You can't do that. It must be one univocal CCD, and it must be a fundamental. People don't get the measurement ranges wrong within a CCD. For instance, if you give them the right CCD of amount of sacrifice that a morality condones, they have no trouble getting the idea of no sacrifice, some sacrifice, or a lot of sacrifice, regardless of who it is. Or what's another, extremism, right? The error there is not that people think, who is a real nebbish? We used to have Mr. Peepers, Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's not that people think, gee, Mr. Rogers is an extremist like Hitler. No one gets that wrong. They know who the extremists are by their CCD. The problem is the CCD is the wrong CCD. The issue is not how much of intensity you apply to pursuing your values. It's whether the values are pro-life or anti-life, or in this case, pro-freedom or anti-freedom. So the problem is that the CCD is wrong. The CCD should be force versus freedom. Then you're not tempted to put George Washington together with Adolf Hitler. But if the CCD is how committed are they and how much did they act upon their political ideology, well then Hitler and George Washington are extremes. So it's not the measurement. It's not that they get Mr. Rogers in there. It's that the standard of measurement is wrong. It's not the application. It's the wrong CCD. And that's true of all the package deals that we see that are wrecking our political discussion, or maybe I should say that our political yellings in today's context. Okay, so let's move on to what you have got when you have got a concept. Ayn Rand has this fantastic analogy, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of a concept to a file folder. Since concepts represent a system of cognitive classification, in itself a totally new idea, since concepts represent a system of cognitive classification, a given concept serves, speaking metaphorically, as a file folder in which man's mind files his knowledge of the existence it subsumes. The analogy is fantastic. Unfortunately, it's a little dated. So I have a more modern analogy, a Wikipedia entry. A concept is like a Wikipedia entry. It stores information on a certain type of thing. And you notice there's even a picture there, and you have the equivalent for your concepts. If I say dog, you can remember or conjure up, through imagination, a picture of a dog. Most of your concepts, if they're not too terribly abstract, you can easily remember a concrete or two. But the concept does not store every dog you've ever seen. The concept stores the knowledge you have that applies to every dog you've seen. Now, just taking another step further, the word is like the Wikipedia heading, camera, and it plays a crucial role, but not as the object, not what we are thinking about, but as form, as how. The word is an information handling device. The word, Ayn Rand says, is what you use to complete the integration. To complete the integration. Before you have the word, you may see that these tables are similar to this podium, this table. The tables in front of you look similar to this as opposed to the stairs going up here or the carpet or the microphone stand. You can see that similarity and you might, quote, get it. But if you don't tie it down with a word, you haven't made a new mental entity. So you need a word table or another word of your choice to hold this integration in mind, to make it really a full integration rather than just a pile. I like to say that before you firm it up with a word, you just have sorted things into piles. There's these look similar as opposed to these. So you've got a pile, and you go out of the room, and it's gone. The word makes it into an entity. The word is what actually integrates things into a concept. Just like in Wikipedia or on your computer, if you type in and don't save under a file name, or you don't have a heading on Wikipedia, you might as well not exist. That information you could still exist. But the information in there is gone if you don't save it. Even if it were written to disk, but you don't know the file name, you can't get it. So it's not just the difference between hard drive and RAM, it's the fact that you cannot access the information if you haven't saved it under a label that you can get. Now, if you're going to go back to the file folder just for completeness, if you're going to go back to the old physical file folder example, what is the word? What's the analogy to the word? Label, raise your hand if you think it's lame. Wrong. It's the folder. It's the manila thing into which you put the pages. The label is analogous to the definition. The definition, just as the label tells you quickly what's in the folder, the definition tells you quickly what's in your concept, so to speak. But it's the word. The word is what binds the things together. You associate all the information to that word. The word is like You know, you could tie it with string, and then the word would be the string, or you could have a loose leaf binder with a clip thing, and then the word would be the binder, because the word binds, that's its function. It does not explain. So you could have a word that did this that would not yet have a definition. Like Rourke in The Fountainhead talks about the principle behind the Dean. Now that's a phrase, but he could shorten it to Dean principle. But he doesn't know what it is yet. He doesn't have a definition of it. He knows there's a phenomenon there. He sees a similarity between the Dean and Keating and certain other people, but he hasn't got the idea of the second-hander yet. So the word is that which holds the things together. It doesn't explain them. It just retains them and makes them into a one, into an entity. You can put it into your brain and pull it back out of your brain. It's a handle on them, on the information. So let me read you the summary of where we are right now. This is Professor A talking at the beginning of the appendix. I really like Professor A because he's me. I hadn't intended to reveal the identity of people until 50 years after, but it's 47 years after. So I will tell you that Professor A is me and Professor B is Alan Godhelf. I'll give you that much. Professor A says, I want to check my understanding of your theory of concept formation. What I would like to do is give a brief summary of the process and ask you to comment as to whether I understand it correctly. All right, she says. First of all, I'd like to distinguish the objectivist position on concept formation from the Aristotelian position. According to the Aristotelians, there is some common element or essence which is identical in all the concretes of a given kind. And concept formation is simply the selective awareness of that element. So for Aristotle, the manness of men would be something that you would merely focus on selectively. And the manness of each man is the same. The objectivist position is that the manness of each man is specific, or not the manness, but the characteristic of rationality. As I understand it, each person's form of rationality has specific measurements. And my rationality or manness would not be literally identical to someone else's. But what we do in concept formation, through a process of measurement omission, is integrate the concretes according to their common attributes. Now, as I understand it, the measurement omission is accomplished by means of differentiation. Take the concept of blue. You begin as a child with two blue objects of different shades, perhaps, so their specific color measurements differ, and say one red object. And then you are able to see that the two blues belong together as opposed to the red. Whereas if you just consider the two blues by themselves, you would only be aware of the differences between them. And then you wouldn't see them as similar until you contrasted them to the red. She says, that's right. Then I say, now the heart of the matter that I want to check on is this. Is it that by means of this differentiation, you see blueness as a range or category of measurements within the conceptual common denominator color? That's the way that I understand it. You see the blue of this object and the somewhat different blue of that other object. Both have specific measurements, but those measurements fall into one category as opposed to the measurements of some red object which fall outside that category. So that the omission of measurements is seeing the measurements as falling within a given range or category of measurements. And she interrupts to say, yes. And then I continue, within the conceptual common denominator. She had said yes before I could get that out. And then she says, yes, that's right. Now, the essential thing there is that you cannot form a concept by integration alone or by differentiation alone. See, I only mentioned differentiation. You need both, always. You need to observe similarities in a certain group of objects and differences from some other group of objects within the common standard or kind of measurement, so that you could differentiate a red cup from two blue cups, but you couldn't differentiate a blue cup from a heavy stone. There is no conceptual common denominator in that kind of distinction. Does that answer your question? Yes, I say. Then she continues, there's one thing I want to correct you on, unless it was just foreshortening. You said that madness consists of rationality. Don't ever forget the full definition is rational animal. Otherwise, you may give the impression that rationality is the equivalent of the concept man. So let's stop there. And there we have her endorsing what I've been saying, and I want to add one other thing that I didn't pull out of this approach. Why do the two things that are near look like they belong together, look the same compared to the one that's far? Now you may think, well, it's obvious. I mean, they just do look like they're close, and this looks like it's far. There's a principle behind it. It's a principle I call consciousness being a difference detector. So what you have here is two sets of differences. The difference between the A and the B, which is small, and the difference between both of them and the C, the foil, which is huge. You set it up to make it huge. If it isn't, you can't really see a similarity. So the bigger difference is what consciousness goes to. And in comparison, the little difference, you respond to, well, that's no difference at all. The big difference swamps the little difference and makes it appear as similarity, not difference. So by the standard of this difference, this ain't a difference. There's no difference here. This is difference. You want difference? Here's difference. This isn't difference. That's the way your consciousness responds because it's attuned to differences. It's a difference detector. It's a discriminator. The next topic under, what have you got when you got a concept? Is you've got your Wikipedia entry has to be expandable. Your file, if it's the old-fashioned kind, you have to be able to put new papers into it. A concept is open-ended. I said all this. Here we are. Concept is open-ended in her terminology. And it's open-ended in two very different ways. I guess neither one's more important. The first crucial way is that it's open-ended in what you put into it, in the information stored. So you learn a new thing about cameras, and you put it up on the Wikipedia site. You learn a new thing about dogs, and you put it into your concept. You learn a new thing about concepts, and you put it into your concept. So they exist to hold your knowledge, and when your knowledge grows, of course, your file for that knowledge has to expand. The second way the concepts are open-ended is in application. You come across a new concrete, a new dog. The information in the file applies to that new dog even though you've never seen it before. Now, there are two fallacies that deny this. One is the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, which says concepts stand for only the information in content that we knew when we formed it in the first place. So if we learned that we begin with Ayn Rand's example of an infant who conceptualizes people, man, as a thing that moves and makes noises because it doesn't have any pets. So the only thing that moves and makes noises, talks, in other words, is the mommy and daddy and maybe brother and sister. Then it learns that the people wear clothes. It gets they were wearing clothes all the time, but it focuses on that. And none of the other things have these clothes on them. Or that they sit down to eat. It could be anything. Well, the purpose of a concept is to hold that in there. But the analytic-synthetic dichotomy says, oh, well, this is a problem. This is a synthetic connection. This just happens to be the case. This is the first thing was the criterion of forming a concept. It's a definition. It moves and makes noises. Now we've got another fact that we don't see the connection to it, except they're both attributes of the same entity. That's not good enough for them. So they make a dichotomy between what you knew when you formed the concept and all your later knowledge. So that's one error. The other is what she calls the frozen abstraction. The frozen abstraction. There's only one reference to this in the whole objectivist literature, and it's in an article in the very early Objectivist newsletter from 1962, and I'm not sure which article it is, but she gives the example of people who freeze their concept of morality after learning the most homey one, altruism. So for them, egoism isn't a concept of morality at all because they equate morality with altruism. And they just have frozen the abstraction code of values to guide your choices and action on this one theory of what you should be after. They can't or won't unfreeze it and see that there's an alternative. And philosophers are as guilty as the common person about this, on this topic. There's also the fallacy she calls arrested knowledge. Arrested knowledge. There's a reference in Galt's speech about arresting knowledge, which I think occurs more on the propositional level than the level of concepts. But some people have the attitude, I know enough. Morality, yeah, I've learned that. I know about that. Justice, yeah, I learned that in Sunday school. I know what that is. Capitalism, I know enough about that. I don't have to study anymore. Actual concepts used by rational people are like living things. They have to be watered and nurtured and fertilized and kept up to date. They are not static entities, but they're organic outgrowths of the whole process of consciousnness. So a commitment to updating your mental files or your internal Wikipedia entries is part and parcel of being a rational being. If you don't do that, then you're guilty of the fallacy of arrested knowledge, and your concepts die. They have to be, a physical file that's not kept up to date becomes worthless. The purpose of a file is to take continuing new information. So the open-endedness is essential to a concept being what it is, an information storage and retrieval device. Finally, we get to the purpose. The purpose, the function, the cognitive role of concepts. This fellow here symbolizes our view of that, and I'm sure you all know about the crow epistemology. The principle is there's a limit on the number of units, distinct items, that you can hold in focal awareness at one time. Concepts overcome the limit. It is not that man can hold more units than the crow. It's that he can combine 1,000,000 units into one. So table, how many tables are there? But you combine it into one thing, and you can deal with them wholesale. Now, just to illustrate the crow epistemology quickly, let's take the numbers 6, 4, 9. Now, what was the first of those numbers? 6. Now let's take the numbers 2, 8, 3, 7, 5, 2, 9, 7, 1, 6, 4, 3, 5, 3, 7, 2, 2, 9, 4, 6, 3. What was the 8th number? You don't know. There's no difference between those two examples. I don't know what it is, David, so I can't. If you don't write it down or use some aid, you can't tell that. And the only difference between 6, 4, 9 in that long list and saying the first number and saying what was the 8th number is degree, is number of units. It's purely quantitative difference. What the concept does is it expands your range of awareness by condensing the number of units you have to hold. And this is the principle behind all rational conceptual functioning. Economy. Economy is the principle behind, for instance, essentialization. If it weren't for the crow, we wouldn't need to essentialize. Just why essentialize? Why essentialize Atlas Shrugged? What's Atlas Shrugged about? Well, it's about, then you start with who is John Galton. You just read out the whole of Atlas Shrugged. You wouldn't need to essentialize. What's so good about capitalism? Well, sit down and I'll talk to you for a half a year and then you'll know what's so good about it. You have to essentialize because you cannot hold all that information in one frame of awareness. The need for definitions. The same thing. Why do we need definitions? It's only because of that difference between 6, 4, 9 and that long number. If you had only 3 concepts, table, cookie, dog, you wouldn't need definitions. You could remember them. You could hold each of those in your mind separately and not forget them, and you could get one up from the subconscious and put another one back down into subconscious. There'd be no problem. You wouldn't need to. What is dog again? It's not possible you could forget it. Cookie, what was that? Was that the thing with the tail? No, you wouldn't have any problem. But when you have, the average English speaker is 20,000 words, each one representing either a proper name or a concept. You can't keep order among 20,000 units without a system and definitions of that system. How about art? Is there a connection between art and the crow? According to Objectivism, the only reason you care about art and need art and love art is that you can't hold in mind the totality of your philosophy as a whole series of abstract theses. Art brings man's metaphysical value judgments down to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allows him to perceive them as if they were concretes. But you could do that in your own mind in an instant if it weren't for the crow. You could just reel off the connections of I am efficacious to what it means every day by just doing a reduction and holding it all easily. But we can't because we have a crow. We have a limit on what we can hold in one focal awareness. So, Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology is kind of hard to hold that, but you think, oh, Ayn Rand answering a question, and how smart she is, and how quick she is, and how essentialized she is, and that's inspiring. Now, that's not art because it's not fiction, it's real life, but it's the same principle in art. Or you think of Francisco, if you want art, putting down an opponent in conversation. That is the objectivist epistemology in action. You can't get it theoretically because there's too many items, too many steps. Economy is not a convenience. Economy, say, in writing, economy in speaking, economy in teaching. I mean, economy of units. I'm not talking about economy of dollar spending, but it's the same thing in principle. Economy is not a convenience. You simply can't grasp something if you're overloaded. It's the difference between getting the answer and not getting the answer. For instance, here's a puzzle. Brothers and sisters have I none, but this man's father is my father's son. Who is he? Brothers and sisters have I none, but this man's father is my father's son. Now, the only thing, no, it's not you. It's not you. The only thing that makes that difficult, it makes it boggle your mind, is you can't hold all the relationships, the pointers to the pointers. This man's father is my father's son. I'll unpack it for you. You start, like in programming, inside the last parentheses. So we have my father's son. My father's son. Who is that? That's me. Because he says, I have no brothers and sisters. It could be your brother, but he begins, brothers and sisters have I none, but this man's father is my father's son. So this man's father is me. This man, there's some man whose father is me. Who is that man? He's my son. So the answer is my son. But boy, is it hard to keep those pointers straight because of the Crow epistemology. There's nothing hard once you take it step by step. So the Crow epistemology, obeying it, being economical, not overloading consciousness, is the difference between getting an answer and not getting an answer. I also like to think of being lost in the woods. You're lost in the woods at night, deep in the woods, and you don't know which way to go, but you could try a way, but you don't know after a while whether you should now turn this way or that way, and then there's more choices to turn this way or that way. You could die, right, before you get out of this woods. Now suppose instead of deep woods, it's like 18 trees. Well, then it doesn't matter. You just try any direction, and in a few steps, you'll see the opening. You'll be out of the woods. So the difference is when things get complicated, consciousness can't see the answer, can't see the way out. You're lost. So the need to simplify, condense, unit economy, is the key to success in consciousness and the key to success in life. To close the whole discussion of concepts, I'm going to quote from Ayn Rand's quoting of my favorite movie, which is The Miracle Worker, which she described as the only epistemological play that was ever written to her knowledge. The core of objectivism is that reason is man's means of survival, and the tools of reason are concepts. In The Miracle Worker, Ayn Rand quotes two passages on concepts. They're stated in terms of words, but it's clear because the whole theme of The Miracle Worker is the word is not just a symbol. The word stands for the concept of the thing in reality. So here is Annie Sullivan. Helen, oh, do you know about the miracle work? I'm just kind of taking that for granted. That's a play about how Helen Keller, who went at age 18 months blind and deaf, was able to be taught through sign languages concepts, and how that changed her from a wild animal, which is essentially what she was, into a civilized, intelligent human being who went on to do actually very powerful intellectual work. That's maybe a little misleading. She became a woman of letters, and she became able to write in Braille and make tremendous writings, to do very moving writings despite her handicap. And her teacher was Annie Sullivan. She had a big struggle. And Annie Sullivan says to Helen's father, quote, "Words can be her eyes to everything in the world outside her, and inside too. What is she without words? With them she can think, have ideas, be reached. There's not a thought or fact in the world that can't be hers. And she has them already. 18 nouns and 3 verbs, they're in her fingers now. I need only time to push one of them into her mind. One, and everything under the sun will follow." That's because she knew how to make the signs for these nouns and verbs, but she didn't know that they stood for anything in reality. She had the symbol, but not the concept. And then this is Annie Sullivan talking to Helen, little Helen, who's 8 years old, and can't hear her because she's deaf. "I wanted to teach you. Oh, everything the earth is full of, Helen, everything on it that's ours for a wink and it's gone. And what we are on it, the light we bring to it and leave behind in words. Why, you can see 5,000 years back in a light of words. Everything we feel, think, know, and share in words. So not a soul is in darkness or done with, even in the grave. And I know one word, and I can put the world in your hand. And whatever it is to me, I won't take less. So don't you take less either." Thank you very much. We have a little time for questions, a couple of minutes, and tomorrow will be entirely devoted to questions. So we'll get to them. Yes?
You said earlier that the reason why I have concepts is to move beyond the crow. So
Kiss the mic, I can't hear you.
So the reason why I have concepts
Kiss it. Kiss it. Look, you said earlier, yeah.
I said earlier that... Oh, you said earlier that, Tom. The crow epistemology... The crow epistemology is why we need concepts, okay? So,
yes.
And that's one reason why we have to form lower concepts to form higher ones. We have to know what a dog and a cat is before we can know what animals are.
I wouldn't put it quite that way, but you're leading somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
My point is, if we had a broader crow, if instead of holding like 7 units, we go 20 or 30, could we go straight to something like animal or color before we even had the notion of red
Yes.
or blue? And if we had a smaller crow, would we only be able to figure out, like, okay, that this is a cardinal, this is a blue bird, before we could figure out
Not quite.
birds?
Yeah, I think your intent is correct. The intent of the question is, does the size of our crow govern how many differences we can embrace in our first concept so it influences the hierarchy? If we had a bigger crow, maybe we could start by distinguishing animal from plant. In principle, yes. In practice, the size of crows does not make much difference. I have a small crow. You think I'm very intelligent, but I have a small crow. I can't really hold more than 3 units with any kind of clarity. And I get lost all the time with the pointers, and I have to, take it slow. The difference between a concept and the concretes is billionfold. So the difference between being able to hold 3 clearly or 5 clearly or 20 clearly, which human can do, is just lost. It just doesn't matter. So if you can only hold 3 units and you form concept A first and then concept B and then concept C, and a Martian can go right to concept B and then to concept C, doesn't make any difference, because once you got the concepts, you're doing on such a scale that the size of the crow becomes an irrelevant factor. Incidentally, I wonder if I should say, let me just stop with there. So in theory, you're right. In practice, it doesn't matter. In fact, the way that Ayn Rand got to her theory of concepts was that she was told about the crow story, about the actual literal crows that could distinguish 3 from 4, but not 4 from 5. And the person telling her said, well, as human beings, we can do much better than that. And that's what makes us human. We can distinguish more units. And she said, no. It's not what makes us human. The difference in our crow size from the crow, from the actual what the crow can hold, is irrelevant. It's that we have a way of beating any crow. We have a crow transcender, which is to condense many into one. So don't worry if you think your crow is small. Mine is too. Yes.
So I'm still wrapping my head around what you said about word being a form versus the
Yes.
object. So in order to understand it better, can I think of it this way? Can I say, well, there's an concrete, an object, and then concept, and then word. So the concept is the form, whereas the concrete is the object.
Right.
And then the word is the form, and the concept is the object.
No. Close.
Okay.
The word is the form of the form. The concept is still not the object. I think it would be very dangerous to say that the word stands for the concept. I would say the word embodies the concept. The word is the form the concept takes. But as I'm talking to you now, it is not that you see a whole lot of concepts. You see a whole lot of facts. Now, this is kind of abstract, but if I said, I moved to Florida and a lot of palm trees there, and I live in a big, open, Spanish-style house with the pond in back, and it has a fountain in it, you're seeing a lot of things. You're not calling up a lot of concepts. You are as the mechanics behind it, but you're not aware of that. So you're aware of the objects that are coming to mind, you're aware of the words, but you're not aware of a middle thing. And I think the connection of the word to the concept, it's like the concept is the word's use. It's not a middle entity that gets to become object for the form, which is the word.
Across languages, the most commonly used words seem to have the most definitions, meaning presumably that they stand for the most concepts. I'm just curious if there's some other principle of economy involved in reusing labels, or why that phenomenon would
don't
happen.
know. I don't know if you could hear his question, but the short, commonly used words are often given many meanings, like set is supposed to have 20 different concepts that it's used for. Set. Obviously, I have a tea set it on the table, the hen set on her eggs, the set of all people who are over age 80 So there are obviously many, and right could mean politically right, it could mean correct, it could mean the opposite of left. So the question is there some principle that governs the reusing of a word for a new meaning? And there may well be, but I don't know what it is, and I'm not convinced that every language does that a lot. Does anyone speak Italian? How about Spanish? Okay, do you know if Spanish does that to the extent English does? Because I suspect it doesn't. Use the same word from radically different concept. Probably does it to some extent, but I think English is funny in that way, that it does it more than others. Yes?
Hi. You've been emphasizing the extent to which concept formation consists in measurement or making or quantitatively relating by the more and the less. So given that and what you said in response to a question yesterday about Ayn Rand wanting to integrate epistemology with neurophysiology to make it quantifiable, and what we know from the work of people like Alan Turing and Ada Lovelace about how any function that can be reduced to information processes can be reproduced by computers.
Right.
Do you think there are any implications for artificial intelligence, not in the sense of machines being aware or intentional, but being able to perform some of these kinds of processes?
I do, sort of. Yes, if there are implications for artificial intelligence, not literally conscious computers, which is a contradiction in terms, but for better processing. I do in the sense that object-oriented programming, which is a big advance in programming, was somewhat due to introduction to objectivist epistemology. Grady Booch, one of the creators of object-oriented programming, has some kind of vague credit to Ayn Rand somewhere. You know, I read this, it was stimulating. Adam Reed has pursued that, I think, and it's not a very tight connection at all, and he doesn't really know objectivism. But there has been an input, and I think from the very little I understand about object-oriented programming, it's a computer equivalent to entities being the basis of perception. The object is like an entity in perception. These things are only analogies, and I think computers, the computers we're familiar with work by a different principle than the brain, which is itself a kind of computer. The computers I'm familiar with work by addresses. So each piece of information has a number associated with it that can be translated into a position on your hard drive or a position in RAM. So the file for lecture notes on concepts is in sector 72, track 3B. And that's how it retrieves, knows how to retrieve it. But we don't address things in the brain. It's only associational. It's only that some things can pull up other things. So there's some differences there. But I think each field can shed light on the other. I think computers do shed light on cognition, and I think cognition does shed light on computers. It's just that tends to be overdone by materialist philosophers and materialists in computer science. But there is something real there.